I welcome you to my channel. Subscribe and listen to my new stories every day. I never thought I'd be one of those men who'd be driven to this point. Revenge was something I read about, shook my head over, and maybe judged a bit too harshly. I'm Rick, 42, a family guy who thought he'd found the right partner in life. For over 15 years, Diane and I built a life that looked perfect on paper, a family with 2 kids, a home with a backyard, weekend BBQs, and holidays by the sea. I thought we had everything we needed. More than anything, I thought I had Diane's love and loyalty. Turns out, I'd been living a lie for a long time. At first, the signs were so subtle that they barely registered. Diane started coming home later than usual, talking about work trips that were suddenly popping up on her schedule. These trips became more frequent, stretching from a single night to weekends, with vague explanations like, "They really need me on site," or "My team isn't keeping up." I tried to ignore the gnawing feeling in my gut, the sense that something was wrong. Diane was a dedicated worker, and our lives were busy. I chalked it up to midlife challenges, assumed we were just settling into the daily grind like everyone else. But it wasn't just the work trips. Diane's phone was suddenly glued to her hand, and every so often, I'd catch her quickly swiping away messages, her thumb moving just a bit too fast when I entered the room. Once, she even took it into the bathroom during dinner. That night, I laughed it off, but inside, something didn't sit right. I didn't want to be the kind of husband who accused his wife of things he couldn't prove. But I also didn't want to be played for a fool. Then there was her appearance. Diane was always put together, but now, she seemed different. She'd always been beautiful, but now she looked like someone trying a bit too hard. New dresses showed up in the closet, clothes I'd never seen her wear around me, and she was spending more time getting ready before work events. Perfume lingered a little too strongly when she returned late at night. A few times, she came home smelling like someone else's cologne. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe her coworkers were overly friendly with hugs, or it was just from a crowded restaurant. But the doubts kept piling up, chipping away at the trust I'd once taken for granted. The breaking point came one Saturday morning. Diane was rushing out the door, saying she'd be out running errands. She left her phone on the counter in her rush, and it lit up just as she disappeared through the door. I wasn't trying to invade her privacy, but I glanced over instinctively. A message from T flashed on the screen, "Can't wait to see you tonight." Those 6 words felt like a slap. I picked up her phone, staring at the message, my heart pounding as I read it again and again. I stood there, numb, the morning sun casting long shadows across our kitchen. This wasn't some wild imagination of mine. This was real. She'd been lying to me. For how long? Who was this person? How could she look me in the eyes, laugh with our kids, sit at our table, and still betray me with someone else? I felt my stomach twist, felt my chest tighten as I stood there, unable to put the phone down. My world, which had once felt steady and certain, had been turned upside down. I wanted to deny it, wanted to shove the phone back on the counter and forget what I'd seen. But denial wouldn't bring back the trust one had in her, wouldn't change what I now knew. That message had shattered any illusions I'd been clinging to. For the rest of the morning, I walked around in a daze. Memories of Diane and me flooded back, each moment tarnished by the thought that maybe she'd never been fully honest. The realization weighed heavily, pressing down on me with every passing second. When she came back that afternoon, I watched her closely. She was cheerful, her usual self, acting like nothing was out of the ordinary. As she moved around the kitchen, humming to herself, it took everything I had to keep my face neutral, to not let on that I knew her secret. My mind screamed at me to confront her, to demand an explanation, but something held me back. I wanted proof. If I confronted her now, she'd deny it, and I'd be back to square one, living in doubt and suspicion. I needed something concrete, something undeniable. Over the next few days, I kept my head down, watching and waiting. I found myself lying awake at night, wondering how much of our life together had been built on lies. I thought of our kids, their innocent faces, their trust in us as parents. I couldn't bear the thought of them being affected by this. Whatever I did next, I knew I had to be smart about it. Eventually, I found a way. Diane was always careful with her phone, but there were gaps, moments when she left it on the counter or set it down to go grab something from the next room. I waited for one of those moments, and when she wasn't looking, I took a quick look through her messages. My hands were shaking as I scrolled, but I needed to know the truth. The texts between Diane and T were all there, painfully clear, documenting every stolen moment and hidden rendezvous. The messages were a painful, raw reminder of the betrayal I had tried so hard to ignore. They spoke in familiar, tender words, words I thought had been ours alone. They planned late-night meetings, discussed weekends, even laughed about our life together like it was some sort of cover story. With each line, I felt another part of me harden, my heart numbing to her, the love we once had fading into something darker. For 2 weeks, I played the part of the oblivious husband, smiling and going along with our daily routines, all while piecing together the truth. Diane probably thought she was clever, that she could hide this from me forever. But every dinner, every small talk we had, was now laced with my own silent fury. I was no longer the trusting husband she'd grown used to. I was someone else, someone who could see the cracks, who understood the extent of her lies. I had a decision to make, but I wasn't ready yet. I needed time to prepare, to ensure that whatever I did next would be definitive. In the days that followed, I struggled to keep myself from confronting Diane. Anger, betrayal, and resentment simmered under the surface, but I knew that a rash confrontation wouldn't get me the closure I wanted. I needed to keep up the act, to play along while I gathered all the proof. If I confronted her too soon, she'd deny it, maybe even make me feel like I was overreacting. And I wasn't about to let her paint me as the irrational husband in this. So, I started planning. It wasn't easy. Every time she looked at me with those innocent eyes or talked about some upcoming family event, I felt the fury flare up again. But I kept my cool, reminded myself of the bigger picture. After work, I'd stay up late, researching everything I could about tracking phone records and reading through financial statements to catch any unusual spending. One night, I finally got a break. Diane had left her phone on the kitchen counter while she went to get ready for bed. With a steady hand, I picked it up and quickly took a few photos of her recent messages with T, documenting the nights they'd been together. Each message was another strike against her, proof of every betrayal. There was no turning back now. I knew I had to find out who T was, so the next day, I took things a step further. I logged into our phone account online, something we both shared for bills. There, it was easy to pull up Diane's call records. Sure enough, T appeared all over her history, especially on nights when she claimed to be out with friends or working late. A quick internet search revealed his full name, Tom, someone I didn't know but who seemed familiar enough to her. The idea that she could be so careless, that she would leave behind such obvious clues, almost made me laugh. She thought she was being discreet, that she was clever enough to cover her tracks, but every detail I uncovered only made her look more foolish. If there's one thing I'd learned in my career, it's that people who think they're clever are usually the easiest to catch. Diane had clearly underestimated me, and now, her arrogance would be her downfall. In the days that followed, I continued to gather my evidence, patiently laying out every piece. Bank statements showed odd charges, fancy dinners, hotel stays, and even gifts I'd never seen. Each transaction felt like a knife twist, a reminder of how she'd been living a double life right under my nose. I didn't confront her about it, didn't even drop hints. I let her continue with her charade, all while feeling more and more like a stranger in my own marriage. Every evening, Diane and I went through our usual routine. She'd ask about my day, and I'd share some innocuous details from work, playing along as if everything were fine. It felt surreal, like I was acting in a play where I already knew the final scene. Occasionally, she'd even initiate intimacy, and I'd go along with it, though it took every ounce of strength I had to pretend. In those moments, I found myself calculating how much longer I could stomach this, how long I could keep up the act until I finally exposed her for what she was. One Friday, she told me she'd be staying late again for work. My stomach tightened, knowing she was probably with him, but I simply nodded and wished her a good night. The moment she left, I sprang into action. I checked her location on our shared phone account and, sure enough, she was headed across town. I followed the route until her location finally stopped at a hotel. That was all I needed. I took screenshots and saved them, documenting everything carefully. This time, there would be no explanations or cover-ups. Diane's betrayal was as clear as day. But gathering proof wasn't enough. I needed a plan, a way to make sure she couldn't wiggle out of this or try to play the victim. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of twisting this situation into something that made her look innocent. I contacted a lawyer discreetly, explaining everything, laying out each detail of my discoveries. He listened patiently, gave me advice on the best steps to take, and agreed to help me draft the divorce papers in a way that left her with as little leverage as possible. As I left his office that day, I felt a weight lifting off my shoulders. For the first time in weeks, I had a clear path forward. The next few days were tense. Diane continued her routine, oblivious to the fact that I knew everything. I watched her with a strange fascination, wondering how someone who once seemed so honest, so dedicated, could hide so much. She'd sit with me at dinner, smiling and chatting as if our marriage was rock solid, as if nothing was wrong. Her act was flawless, but I saw through every word, every gesture. Then, one evening, she caught me by surprise. After we'd put the kids to bed, she sat down next to me, looking a bit nervous. I almost thought she was about to confess, but instead, she talked about planning a family trip in the spring. She went on about potential destinations, talking about things we could do with the kids, reminiscing about trips we'd taken in the past. I listened quietly, my hands clenching as she described a future she'd never intended to be part of. Her gall was staggering. Inside, I was fuming. I wanted to throw everything out in the open right then and there, to tell her that her lies were over. But instead, I played along, knowing my revenge was close. I nodded along, adding suggestions, letting her plan the trip as if I had any intention of taking it. In reality, I knew that by spring, she'd be out of my life for good. When she finally went to bed that night, I sat alone in the living room, replaying everything in my mind. The anger, the pain, the betrayal, it all boiled down to this moment. Soon, she would realize that every lie she'd told, every stolen moment, was about to come crashing down. And when she did, I'd be ready. The next morning, I finalized my plans with my lawyer. We went over the details carefully, discussing everything from finances to custody arrangements. I'd always been the steady one in the relationship, the one who handled the practical side of things, and now, that calm approach was my biggest asset. Diane wouldn't see it coming. To her, I was still the trusting husband, the man who believed in her without question. But all that was about to change. The day after our meeting, I set everything in motion. I arranged to have our accounts separated, my assets protected, and the divorce papers prepared. I'd spent weeks letting her believe she was safe, letting her think that she could get away with everything. But soon, she'd be forced to face the truth. This time, I wouldn't be the one left in the dark. As I sat in the lawyer's office that last time, signing the final documents, I felt a strange sense of relief. The burden of her lies, the weight of every deceitful word and hidden affair, was finally lifting. I wasn't just ending a marriage, I was freeing myself from a person who'd taken me for granted, who thought she could lie and cheat without consequence. The only thing left now was the reveal. And for that, I had something special in mind. The final pieces were in place. My lawyer had helped me set up everything, from the financial protections to the custody arrangements for the kids. Diane wouldn't be able to twist this into something it wasn't, not with all the evidence I had. Every lie, every deceitful message, every suspicious work trip was now neatly documented, ready for her to see. I kept replaying how I'd break it to her, wondering if I'd be calm or if the anger simmering inside me would finally explode. It was a Thursday evening when I decided to confront her. I wanted it to be a night she wouldn't forget, a fitting end to this chapter of my life. She'd been distant lately, coming home late and slipping into bed without a word. She probably assumed I was none the wiser, that I was still the trusting husband who couldn't see the truth if it were laid out in front of him. Little did she know, tonight would shatter that illusion. As the clock neared 7, Diane walked through the door, carrying a grocery bag as if she'd been out shopping, playing the role of the dutiful wife. I was waiting for her in the living room, my heart pounding with a mixture of anger and anticipation. She glanced at me, giving me a warm smile that, once upon a time, would have felt comforting. Now, it just felt hollow. "Hey, Han," she said, setting the bag down. "How was your day?" I looked at her for a moment, trying to mask the storm brewing inside me. "Interesting, actually," I replied. "How was yours?" She shrugged casually, moving into the kitchen. "Oh, you know. The usual. Long day at work." "Is that so?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. "Because, from what I understand, you've had quite a few long days lately." She paused, glancing back at me with a hint of confusion. "Yeah, I guess I have. Busy season, you know how it is." "Right," I said, nodding slowly. "But you weren't at work, were you?" Her expression froze, just for a second, before she forced a laugh. "What are you talking about, Rick?" "I mean," I replied, standing up, "you haven't been at work during those long nights and weekends, have you, Diane? Or should I say, T?" The color drained from her face. She opened her mouth, probably to lie or deny, but no words came out. She just stood there, stunned, as the reality of what I'd said sank in. "Rick, I don't. Don't bother lying, Diane. I know everything." I pulled out the stack of photos I'd printed, the messages I'd captured, the screenshots of her location at hotels she'd never mentioned. One by one, I laid them out on the table between us, each piece of evidence a nail in the coffin of our marriage. Her eyes flickered over the papers, her face pale. "Where did you? How did you?" I shook my head. "Does it matter, Diane? After all these years, after everything we built, this is what you do? Sneak around with someone else and then come home and look me in the eyes as if nothing happened?" She tried to regain her composure, taking a shaky breath. "Rick, it's not what you think. I can explain." I laughed, the sound bitter. "Explain? You want to explain this?" I picked up one of the messages, reading it aloud, "Can't wait to see you again, baby." I tossed it back on the table. "How do you explain that?" She covered her face with her hands, taking another deep breath. It just happened, okay? I didn't mean for it to go this far. Didn't mean for it to go this far." I repeated, feeling the anger finally start to crack through my calm exterior. "You've been meeting him for months, Diane. How far did you think it was going to go?" She looked down, her voice barely a whisper. I was lonely, Rick. You've been so busy with work and the kids, and I felt like I wasn't a priority anymore." I felt a pang of sadness, a flicker of the love I'd once had for her, but it was quickly snuffed out by the betrayal. "So, instead of talking to me, instead of telling me how you felt, you decided to lie, to sneak around and cheat? That's your solution to feeling lonely?" She was silent, her shoulders slumped as if the weight of her actions had finally sunk in. "I didn't know how to tell you. And then it just got out of hand. I wanted to stop, but you didn't," I finished for her. "You just kept going, and you lied to me." Over and over. She looked at me, her eyes filling with tears. I'm sorry, Rick. I didn't mean to hurt you. I never wanted it to end up like this. I felt a strange detachment, as though I was watching this scene from afar. Her apology, her tears, they felt like too little, too late. Sorry doesn't cut it, Diane. Do you have any idea what you've done to this family? To our kids? At the mention of the kids, she seemed to crumple. Rick, please. We can work this out. We can go to counseling, try to rebuild. No, I said firmly, the finality of my words hanging heavy in the air. There's no coming back from this. I've already spoken to a lawyer. The divorce papers are ready. She took a step back, as if I'd slapped her. Divorce? Rick, please, don't do this. We can fix this. I looked at her, feeling a strange calm settle over me. You've been lying to me for months, Diane. I don't want to fix anything. I want my life back. The life you've been throwing away with every lie, every night you spent with him instead of us. Tears streamed down her face, and she fell to her knees in front of me, reaching out. Please, Rick. Please, don't leave me. I made a mistake, but I love you. I love our family. I shook my head, the sadness mixing with anger. If you loved me, Diane, you wouldn't have done this. You wouldn't have thrown away everything we had for what? Some fling. She sobbed, her shoulders shaking, but I couldn't bring myself to comfort her. Her pain, her regret, it all felt hollow to me, a reaction to getting caught, not a genuine sense of remorse. Finally, she looked up at me, desperation in her eyes. Please, Rick. Don't take the kids from me. Don't do this. I felt a stab of pity but forced myself to hold firm. The kids deserve stability, Diane. They deserve parents who respect each other, who don't lie or cheat. We'll work out custody, but don't expect me to stand by while you continue this charade. Her face twisted in pain, and she buried her face in her hands, sobbing harder. For a brief moment, I almost wavered. But then I remembered the messages, the nights she'd left me sitting at home, wondering why things felt off. The betrayal was too deep, the damage done too permanent. After a long silence, I turned away, walking toward the door. I'll move my things out by the weekend. I'll leave the details to the lawyers. As I reached the door, I heard her whisper, Rick. I'm so sorry. Without looking back, I replied, so am I. And then I walked out, feeling the weight of the past few months finally lift, replaced by something colder but, in a strange way, freeing. I knew it would take time, that the wounds from this betrayal would take months, maybe years, to heal. But as I closed the door on that chapter of my life, I felt a spark of hope. The life I'd known was gone, but maybe, just maybe, I could start over. The silence in the house was overwhelming after I walked out. I moved into a small apartment across town, leaving Diane in the home we'd built together for over a decade. My lawyer said it would make the divorce easier if I moved out, at least until custody arrangements were settled. Besides, I couldn't stand to be in that house. Every room was tainted with memories of her betrayal, of nights I'd waited for her to come home, oblivious to the fact that she'd been with someone else. The kids took the news harder than I expected. I had prepared myself for their confusion and anger, but nothing could prepare me for the pain in their eyes as they watched me pack up my things. Our son, Ethan, only 10, sat on the bed, silent and withdrawn. I tried to explain things gently, to make them understand that this wasn't their fault. My daughter, Emma, was 13, old enough to sense something was off but too young to understand it fully. She hugged me tight, whispering, I don't want you to go. The heartbreak in her voice tore at me, a pain sharper than any betrayal Diane could have inflicted. In the days that followed, I fell into a numb routine. I went to work, came back to my empty apartment, and spent hours trying not to think about the life I'd left behind. Diane called every few days, trying to bargain, begging to meet up to talk things through. I ignored her calls, funneling all our communication through the lawyers. I was done with her. Or so I thought. 3 weeks after I left, I got a call from Diane's sister, Clara. We hadn't spoken much over the years, but she called me in tears, her voice barely recognizable. "Rick, you need to come to the house. Please," she said, her voice cracking. "It's Diane, something's happened." A sick feeling churned in my stomach as I drove back to the house. The last place I wanted to go, yet there I was, speeding through traffic with an urgency I didn't quite understand. When I arrived, I found Clara waiting for me at the front door, her face pale and eyes rimmed with red. "What happened?" I asked, feeling the dread settle deeper. Clara looked down, wiping her eyes. "Diane, she's not doing well, Rick. She's been falling apart since you left. I tried to get her to go to therapy, tried to talk to her. She wouldn't listen. Last night, she took a bunch of pills." Her voice broke, and she pressed a hand to her mouth. "The kids found her this morning." The words hung in the air, heavy and crushing. I felt my legs give way, and I sank onto the steps, trying to make sense of what she'd said. Diane, the woman who'd betrayed me, who'd lied to my face, who'd turned our life upside down, she was lying in a hospital bed because of me. "They're not sure if she'll be okay," Clara whispered, sitting down beside me. "Rick, she kept saying she couldn't live with herself after what she did to you and the kids. She was so, full of regret, even before you found out." The pain in her words twisted something in me. Anger I had thought was resolved came flooding back, but it was joined by something else, something darker. Regret. Guilt. I thought leaving would be enough, that walking away would set me free from her, from the mess she'd created. But now, sitting there, I felt anything but free. After a long silence, Clara touched my shoulder. "You should go see her, Rick. She's asked for you. I think she needs to say, whatever it is she didn't say before." My mind rebelled at the idea. I didn't owe Diane anything. She'd destroyed everything we had, not me. But some part of me, the part that had once loved her, couldn't ignore the fact that she was lying in a hospital bed, broken and alone. I drove to the hospital in a daze. The sterile smell, the soft murmur of voices, the beeping machines, all of it felt surreal, like I was walking through a fog. The nurse showed me to her room, and I stood there at the doorway, watching her lying on the bed, pale and frail, her once vibrant face gaunt and hollow. She looked up as I entered, and for a moment, I saw the woman I'd fallen in love with years ago. The woman I thought I'd spend my life with. Her eyes filled with tears as she tried to sit up, her voice a broken whisper. "Rick." I stayed by the door, my hands shoved in my pockets, unsure of what to say. Part of me wanted to turn around and walk away, to leave her in the wreckage she'd created. But the other part of me, the part that remembered all the years we'd shared, kept me rooted to the spot. She took a shaky breath. "I'm so sorry. I know that probably doesn't mean anything now, but I need you to know that I never meant to hurt you like this." Her words hung in the air, empty and desperate. I wanted to scream at her, to tell her that sorry didn't change anything, that it didn't fix the lies or erase the betrayal. But instead, I simply nodded, feeling a numbness settle over me. She continued, her voice barely audible. "I was lost, Rick. I didn't know how to fix things, how to tell you what I was feeling. And I made the worst mistake of my life." Her eyes filled with fresh tears, and she reached out a trembling hand. "Please, if there's any part of you that still cares, just forgive me." I stood there, staring at her hand, the same hand that had once held mine, that had once promised me forever. In that moment, I realized that the forgiveness she was asking for wasn't for her, it was for me. I could walk away and carry the anger, the resentment, the bitterness for the rest of my life, or I could let go. It wouldn't be easy, but holding on to the pain was only destroying me. Taking a deep breath, I stepped forward and took her hand, feeling its cold, fragile grip. Diane. I don't know if I can forgive you. But maybe one day, I'll be able to let this go. She looked up at me, her eyes searching mine, and for the first time, I saw the woman she truly was, flawed, broken, and as lost as I was. Thank you, she whispered, her voice barely a breath. I stayed with her until she fell asleep, my hand still wrapped around hers, holding on to the fragments of a life we'd once shared. When I finally left, I felt a strange calmness wash over me, a bittersweet acceptance of what had been and what would never be again. A few weeks later, I heard from Clara that Diane had been moved to a rehabilitation center. She was trying to pick up the pieces, working through her guilt and pain. I decided not to visit again. It was time to move forward, to focus on the life I still had, the children who needed me. But some nights, as I lay in my empty apartment, the memories crept in. I'd remember her laughter, the way she'd smile when I walked through the door, the life we'd built together and the way it had all come crashing down. And in those quiet moments, I'd wonder if forgiveness was ever truly possible, or if some wounds never healed completely. The life I'd known was over, and the one ahead was uncertain. But as I drifted into sleep, I found a small comfort in knowing that maybe, just maybe, the scars we carried didn't define us. They were simply reminders of the love we'd lost, the lessons we'd learned, and the strength we'd somehow found to carry on.